As Sarah kissed her husband, Mark, goodbye before he left for his late-night work meeting, a flicker of unease settled in her chest. It was the third night this week. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching Mark pull out of the driveway, the glow from his tail lights shrinking into the distance before they disappeared altogether. She had long since grown accustomed to his late nights at work, the sometimes urgent deadlines of his job in project management. But lately, it felt as though these late nights had taken on a life of their own, coming more often, with vaguer reasons. Still, she pushed the thought away, mentally cataloging it under routine work stress. She shut the door and wandered back inside, passing the framed family photos that decorated their hallway. They were all smiles in every picture: her, Mark, and their two children, Ella and Ben. These snapshots from family trips, holidays, and school events were Sarah's pride, small reminders of the life they had built together over the last decade. It was a life that Sarah often thought was close to perfect. They had a comfortable house, two healthy children, and a marriage that, while sometimes tested by the usual ups and downs, was still strong. Yet, recently, that perfect image had started to fray around the edges. She made her way to the kitchen, where Lisa, her close friend and neighbor, was finishing up the dishes. Lisa was her confidant, her friend since their children had started kindergarten together. Over time, Lisa had practically become part of the family, always willing to watch the kids on short notice or step in for a coffee chat whenever Sarah needed. Tonight, she had agreed to help out with the children while Sarah finished up some work projects. They'd settled into an easy routine, one that Sarah had come to depend on. "Thanks for helping with the kids, Lisa," Sarah said, leaning against the counter as she poured herself a cup of tea. "I just feel like I'm drowning in deadlines lately." Lisa flashed her a warm smile. "No problem at all. You know I love those kids like my own. Besides, I don't have much else going on tonight." The two women laughed, and Sarah felt a sense of gratitude. Lisa had been a rock for her during times when Mark's work kept him away. They talked easily about family plans, weekend outings, and shared memories, the small things that made their friendship feel like a sisterhood. But tonight, even Lisa's company couldn't shake the faint unease in Sarah's mind. She couldn't put her finger on what it was, maybe just one of those passing worries that would dissolve by morning. She tried to banish the thoughts as she and Lisa caught up over tea, but the slight nagging feeling remained. Later, after Lisa had left, Sarah walked into her children's room, watching them sleep. The peaceful look on their faces gave her a moment of calm. She wanted to hold on to this feeling of safety, of family, of love, these precious moments that kept her grounded. When she slipped into bed, her thoughts drifted back to Mark. Was she just imagining things? Was she letting trivial worries taint the beautiful life they had built? She decided to leave her doubts aside, reminding herself that marriage was built on trust. She would not let a few late nights cloud the years they had spent building a life together. Yet as she lay in the dark, waiting for the sound of Mark's car pulling into the driveway, the familiar security of her world felt just a little less certain. The next morning, Sarah went through her usual routine, getting Ella and Ben ready for school, packing their lunches, and making breakfast. Mark was already up, typing away on his laptop at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee by his side. As Sarah poured herself a cup, she glanced at him, noticing how focused he seemed. "Good morning," she greeted him, trying to push away the unease from the previous night. Mark looked up with a quick smile. "Morning. Just catching up on some emails before I head in." Sarah watched him, his face a mask of concentration. Normally, he'd offer her a quick kiss or a comment about the day ahead, but today he seemed more distant. She reminded herself that he had been working long hours and told herself not to overthink it. But it wasn't easy. That evening, Mark announced he'd have to work late again. A little knot formed in Sarah's stomach, but she smiled and nodded, not wanting to seem insecure or clingy. He offered her a reassuring kiss on the cheek before heading out the door. As he left, Sarah found herself dialing Lisa's number, almost as if on instinct. "Hey, Lisa. Are you free tonight?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her tone light. "Of course, hon," Lisa replied warmly. "I'll come by after dinner with the kids." Sarah felt relieved. Lisa's presence always helped her feel grounded, and tonight, she wanted someone to talk to. Maybe sharing her vague worries would help ease her mind. Later, as they sat together in the cozy warmth of Sarah's living room, Sarah hesitated before speaking. "Is it weird that I'm feeling, well, a little off about Mark's late nights?" Sarah asked, trying to sound casual. She watched Lisa's face for a reaction, searching for any hint of validation or understanding. Lisa tilted her head thoughtfully. "I wouldn't worry too much, Sarah. Men get busy with work, and sometimes we let our imaginations run wild." Sarah nodded, feeling silly. Of course, she was just overthinking things. Lisa was right, it was just work. But still, there was something about the way Lisa spoke, her voice so even and calm, that left Sarah feeling strangely unsatisfied. She had expected a bit more reassurance, maybe a joke or two about Mark's overzealous work ethic. Instead, she received gentle, placating words that left a lingering sense of discomfort. "Maybe you're right," Sarah said, trying to smile. "I just miss the way things used to be, you know? When everything felt easy." Lisa patted her arm. "Every marriage has its phases, Sarah. You've got nothing to worry about." As the evening wore on, they talked about other things: Sarah's work, plans for the weekend, and their kids' latest antics. But all the while, Sarah couldn't shake a subtle feeling that something was being left unsaid. Why did Lisa seem so calm about it, as if she had already prepared these answers? After Lisa left, Sarah wandered through the quiet house, her thoughts drifting back to Mark. She tried to remember the last time he'd looked at her with that old spark in his eyes, the last time they'd laughed together over something silly. It was then she realized that these late nights were affecting more than just her peace of mind. They were chipping away at her confidence, leaving her feeling less like herself. She missed the connection they once shared, the easy comfort of knowing she was his world. One afternoon, while tidying up the house, Sarah came across a slip of paper tucked in one of Mark's jackets. She almost didn't notice it at first, distracted by the endless laundry list in her head. But when she unfolded it, her stomach tightened. It was a receipt from a small, cozy cafe downtown, a place she and Mark had visited once on a rare date night over a year ago. The date on the receipt was recent, just a few days prior. And there were two items on it, a latte and a slice of chocolate cake. Sarah stared at it, trying to rationalize. Maybe he'd stopped there after work to grab a snack, she told herself. But her mind quickly refuted that thought. Mark wasn't the type to stop for a dessert on his own. And why was there a second item? Unable to ignore her curiosity, Sarah tucked the receipt back into the jacket and went about her day, though her mind was racing with questions. That evening, when Mark came home, she found herself watching him more closely, looking for anything that might hint at an explanation. "Busy day?" she asked casually as he hung up his coat, her heart pounding as she waited for his response. "Yeah, just the usual," he replied, not meeting her eyes as he walked past her and into the kitchen. His tone was neutral, even detached, as if he were on autopilot. Sarah felt a pang in her chest. She wanted to confront him, to ask about the cafe, the late nights, the distance that seemed to be growing between them. But she held back, afraid of the answers she might receive. What if it was all innocent? What if she was wrong, and she ended up hurting their marriage with her baseless suspicions? So she said nothing, pushing the questions down, trying to pretend that everything was normal. But as the days passed, that small slip of paper seemed to grow in her mind, a silent witness to something she couldn't yet see but could feel. A few days later, she casually brought up the cafe while they were having dinner, testing the waters to see if he'd mention anything about going there recently. "Remember that little cafe downtown?" she asked, keeping her tone light. "We should go there again sometime." Mark looked at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, maybe," he replied, before turning his attention back to his plate. There was no flicker of recognition, no suggestion that he'd been there recently. It was as if she hadn't asked him anything at all. That night, as she lay in bed beside him, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. If he'd been at the cafe, why hadn't he mentioned it? Who had he been with? She turned over, her back to him, listening to his steady breathing as he drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling determined. The unease and anxiety of the past few weeks had worn her down, and she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed answers, even if she wasn't sure she wanted to find them. After Mark left for work, Sarah sat down at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, staring out the window. She felt conflicted. This was her husband, the man she'd trusted and loved for years. Part of her felt guilty even considering the idea that he might be hiding something from her. But she reminded herself that trust wasn't about ignoring doubts, it was about facing them and finding the truth. Her first step was small. She went through their phone bills. It seemed silly, almost invasive, but she wanted to see if there was any pattern, any unexplained calls or unusual activity. She sat at the computer, typing in their account information, her heart pounding as she scanned the last few months' records. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The usual calls to her, to his office, to family. But then she saw a number that appeared frequently, at odd hours late at night or during weekends when he'd said he was at work. She stared at it, her mind racing. She didn't recognize the number, and there was no name attached to it. It appeared again and again, almost every night that he'd been out late. And though she tried to deny it, her mind immediately connected the number with Lisa. Sarah's heart sank. She didn't want to believe it, but it made sense. Lisa was the one person who was constantly in their lives, and the thought of her husband being involved with someone outside of their close circle seemed too far-fetched. But Lisa, she was close, trusted, and always available. Sarah felt her stomach twist at the idea. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing. She picked it up to see a text from Lisa. "Hey. Are you free for coffee tomorrow? Would love to catch up." The timing felt too perfect. Sarah had a sudden flash of anger at the possibility that her friend might be hiding something, anger at herself for even suspecting her. But she forced herself to take a deep breath. She couldn't let her emotions run wild. She needed proof, something solid before she confronted either of them. The next day, she met Lisa at their usual cafe. Sitting across from her friend, Sarah felt a strange tension. Lisa was her usual self, warm and cheerful, chatting about her kids and the latest neighborhood gossip. But as Sarah watched her, she found herself scrutinizing every word, every gesture, looking for any sign of guilt or unease. At one point, Sarah casually asked, "Hey, do you know anyone with this number?" She showed Lisa the mystery number from the call log, keeping her tone light, as though she'd found it by chance and was just curious. Lisa glanced at it and shrugged. "No, I don't recognize it," she said, her expression unchanging. "Why? Is something up?" Sarah shook her head, forcing a smile. "Oh, it's nothing. Just a wrong number that keeps calling, I think." But as she watched Lisa's face, Sarah's doubts only deepened. Lisa's answer had been quick, almost too quick, and Sarah felt a sinking feeling in her chest. Was she reading too much into it? Or was Lisa hiding something? One night, unable to hold back any longer, Sarah decided to test her husband's honesty directly. "Mark, do you ever get tired of all these late nights?" she asked, her tone casual but her heart racing. He looked at her, a flicker of something in his eyes she couldn't quite read. "It's just work, Sarah," he said, a little too quickly, then turned back to his food. The distance between them felt wider than ever, a chasm filled with secrets and unspoken words. Sarah knew she couldn't go on like this. She had to find out the truth, even if it meant facing something she wasn't ready for. Sarah felt as though she was living two lives, one as a wife and mother, maintaining the appearance of normalcy, and another as a silent investigator, piecing together fragments of her husband's mysterious actions. The more she watched him, the more isolated she felt, as though she was drifting further from the life she thought she knew. She began checking his phone whenever he left it unattended, hoping to find something that would either confirm her fears or, ideally, put them to rest. But Mark was careful. His call logs were sparse, and he rarely left text messages unaddressed. It was as if he had anticipated her snooping, and the realization sent a chill down her spine. The following morning, after dropping her kids off at school, Sarah made a decision: she would follow him. She felt foolish even considering it, but her desire for answers outweighed her reservations. That night, after dinner, Mark told her he had a late meeting. Sarah nodded, pretending to be her usual self, all the while suppressing the anxiety twisting in her stomach. As he gathered his things, she watched him carefully. Then, as he left, she waited a few minutes, and followed him. Mark's car was easy to spot, and Sarah kept a safe distance as he drove across town. She expected him to head downtown, toward his office, but he took an unexpected turn, leading her down a quiet, residential street, the very street Lisa lived on. Her pulse quickened as he pulled up in front of Lisa's house. He didn't get out right away, and Sarah watched from a distance as he sat there, seemingly lost in thought. Finally, he exited the car, his expression unreadable, and made his way up to the front door. Lisa opened it almost immediately, as though she'd been waiting, and the two of them disappeared inside. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what she had expected, but seeing it was different. Seeing Mark standing on Lisa's doorstep, the easy familiarity between them, it shattered the last remnants of her denial. She sat there for what felt like hours, frozen in place, a mix of rage and sadness welling up inside her. She had hoped, even in her darkest moments, that this was all in her head, that her suspicions were a product of overthinking. But now she had her answer. Finally, she forced herself to drive away, her vision blurred by tears. She needed time to process this, to decide what to do next. The following morning, Sarah awoke feeling hollow, as though her entire world had shifted overnight. The image of Mark and Lisa together haunted her, replaying in her mind with brutal clarity. As she got her children ready for school, she forced herself to smile and carry on as though everything was normal. But inside, she was unraveling. After dropping the kids off, she returned home and sat in the quiet of the living room, letting the silence press down on her. Her mind swirled with a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion. She couldn't wrap her head around how Mark and Lisa, two people she had trusted deeply, could do this to her. Her mind drifted back to the times Lisa had helped with the children, the shared dinners, and the countless conversations they'd had. How long had Lisa been deceiving her? Had their friendship been a lie from the start, or had something changed along the way? For hours, Sarah sat, wrestling with the question of what to do next. Should she confront Mark and demand an explanation? Part of her wanted to scream and demand the truth, but another part of her hesitated. She wasn't ready to hear his excuses, his justifications. And Lisa, how would she confront her former friend, someone she'd trusted with her children and welcomed into her home? The afternoon dragged on as she replayed every conversation, every interaction, searching for clues she might have missed. She found herself scrolling through her text messages with Lisa, looking for any hints of deceit. Lisa's words were friendly, kind, supportive, the last thing she would have expected from someone betraying her. By the evening, Sarah felt emotionally exhausted but no closer to a decision. As she prepared dinner, she rehearsed different scenarios in her mind, imagining what she might say if she confronted Mark. Each imagined conversation left her feeling unsatisfied, as if no words could adequately capture the depth of her hurt. When Mark came home that night, she watched him closely, looking for any sign of guilt. But he was his usual self, greeting her with a smile, asking about her day. The ease with which he carried on as if nothing was wrong made her anger flare, and she struggled to keep her emotions in check. She forced herself to respond casually, pretending that everything was fine, even as resentment simmered beneath the surface. That night, lying in bed beside him, Sarah felt like she was sleeping next to a stranger. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing, her heart aching. She knew she couldn't keep pretending forever, something had to give. Finally, she decided that she would take things slowly, one step at a time. She didn't need to rush into a confrontation, not yet. She needed more information, something concrete that would allow her to approach the situation with a clear head. If Mark and Lisa had hidden this from her for so long, there was a chance they were still being careful. Perhaps there were other secrets waiting to be uncovered. Over the next few days, Sarah's life became a carefully constructed facade. On the outside, she played the role of the devoted wife and mother, carrying on with her daily routines and keeping up with the house and children. But underneath the surface, she was a woman on a mission, each moment filled with suspicion and anger as she pieced together the clues she needed. One evening, while Mark was in the shower, she managed to unlock his phone. Her heart pounded as she scrolled through his messages, fingers trembling as she carefully read each one. Most of his conversations were innocuous work-related or casual exchanges with friends. But just as she was about to give up, she noticed a message thread without a name attached, just an initial, L. Her stomach tightened. She tapped on the thread, eyes scanning the messages. Most of them were short, simple exchanges. Are you free? Can you talk? But there was an intimacy in the words that twisted Sarah's heart. She saw messages suggesting meeting times, vague locations, and hints of shared memories that made her sick to her stomach. It was obvious that L was Lisa. Sarah's hands shook as she read one particular message from Lisa: "Tonight was perfect. I can't wait to see you again." Another message from Mark followed: "Same here. I'll find a way to slip out again soon." The finality of their betrayal was laid bare in those words, undeniable proof of what she'd already feared. Sarah felt her knees go weak, her world crumbling around her as she realized that this wasn't just a fling. There was a familiarity and comfort in the way they spoke to each other, a history that suggested this had been going on for a while. She put the phone down, her mind reeling. The question now was what to do with this information. Confronting Mark would be a leap into an uncertain future, a choice with irreversible consequences. But staying silent felt unbearable. How could she continue living this double life, smiling and pretending everything was normal when her heart was breaking? Over the next few days, Sarah felt trapped, caught between two versions of herself, the one who wanted to confront the betrayal head-on and the one who wanted to cling to the life she'd built, however broken it now seemed. Her resolve hardened, though, as she thought about her children. They deserved a mother who wasn't broken by lies, who wasn't living in a marriage filled with deception. Then, one afternoon, as she was cleaning the kitchen, she received a text from Lisa. "Can you watch the kids for a few hours tonight? I have a meeting." The irony of it nearly made her laugh. How many times had Lisa asked her this, using Sarah's own children as a cover for her meetings with Mark? Instead of responding, Sarah stared at the message, a plan forming in her mind. She would agree to watch Lisa's kids, just as always. But this time, she would follow Lisa and Mark to wherever they planned to meet. She wanted to see it with her own eyes, to confront them in the act. If there was to be a confrontation, she would control it. And they would have no way to deny what they'd done. That evening, Sarah agreed to take the kids, dropping them off at a friend's house once they were asleep, under the pretense of a last-minute errand. Then, she got into her car, adrenaline rushing through her veins as she waited outside Lisa's house, watching as Lisa left and drove off. Following her was nerve-wracking, her heart pounding with every turn. Sarah kept her headlights off, careful not to be seen, her mind racing with every possible outcome. Would she confront them tonight? Or would she simply watch, gathering all the proof she needed? When Lisa finally stopped in front of a small motel just outside town, Sarah's heart shattered. She parked at a safe distance and watched as Lisa got out of the car and walked inside, her steps quick, her demeanor casual. Moments later, she saw Mark's car pull into the parking lot. There it was, the proof she couldn't deny. They were here, together, in this rundown motel, hiding in plain sight. Sarah's hands clenched the steering wheel as she watched, rage and heartbreak mixing in a cocktail of emotions that made her feel sick. In that moment, she knew that there was no going back. She couldn't unsee this, couldn't pretend any longer. She had been betrayed by both her husband and her friend, the two people she had trusted most. And now, she had to decide what to do next. Sarah sat in her car outside the motel, her chest heaving with a mix of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. She had come this far, and now the weight of the decision was crushing her. She could drive away, keep this knowledge to herself, or she could walk right in and confront the two people who had shattered her world. The decision seemed to make itself. She stepped out of her car, each step heavy with resolve as she approached the motel entrance. Her mind replayed the messages she'd seen on Mark's phone, the deceitful exchanges hidden under the guise of friendship. Tonight, it would all come to light. As she walked down the dimly lit hallway, she heard hushed voices coming from behind a closed door. Her heart hammered as she recognized them, Mark's low, familiar tone mingling with Lisa's laughter, soft and intimate. Any last shred of doubt was gone. Without a second thought, Sarah raised her hand and knocked sharply on the door. The voices on the other side fell silent. She could practically feel their panic seeping through the walls as they realized someone was outside. She heard shuffling, whispers, and then, slowly, the door opened. Mark's face appeared, pale and wide-eyed. He froze when he saw her standing there, his shock quickly replaced by a look of sheer horror. Lisa appeared behind him, her expression turning from confusion to a similar shade of dread. They stood there, caught like criminals in the act, with nowhere to hide. "Sarah," Mark stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here?" Sarah's jaw clenched, her anger bubbling over as she looked at the two people who had betrayed her. "Isn't it obvious?" she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I came to find the truth. And here it is, right in front of me." Lisa's face crumpled, her eyes darting from Sarah to Mark, desperately searching for an excuse or explanation that could make any of this right. But there was nothing. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, as Mark and Lisa stood there, shame written across their faces. "I trusted both of you," Sarah said, her voice thick with hurt. "Lisa, you were more than a friend. I let you into my home, let you watch my children, shared things with you that I didn't share with anyone else. And this," she paused, unable to finish, the betrayal too raw to put into words. Lisa opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked away, tears brimming in her eyes, but Sarah had no sympathy left. She turned her gaze to Mark, the man she had promised to love and support through everything. "And you," she said, her voice cracking. "How could you do this to me? To us?" Mark's shoulders slumped, his face etched with regret, but he struggled to find the right words. I didn't mean for it to happen, Sarah," he stammered. It got out of hand. I was going through something, and Lisa, she was there. Sarah's anger flared, and she took a step forward. Going through something? That's your excuse. Instead of talking to me, your wife, you turned to her. She looked at Lisa, the woman she'd thought of as a sister. And you used my trust to get close to him, to take advantage of our friendship. Did either of you even think about how this would destroy me? Lisa looked down, her face pale. I'm sorry, Sarah. I never wanted to hurt you. Sorry. Sarah scoffed, her voice dripping with bitterness. You're only sorry because you got caught. Mark tried to reach out, but Sarah pulled back, holding up a hand to stop him. She wasn't ready to hear his apologies, wasn't ready to consider forgiveness. Right now, all she felt was betrayal, a gaping wound that she wasn't sure would ever heal. After a long, tense silence, Sarah took a shaky breath. I deserve better than this, she whispered, more to herself than to them. She turned, leaving the two of them standing there, trapped in the consequences of their own actions. As she walked out of the motel, Sarah felt a strange sense of liberation. Her life had been shattered, yes, but now she was free from the lies, the secrets, the betrayal. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she wouldn't let their betrayal define her. Sarah drove home in a daze, her mind racing with the events of the night. The silence in the car was deafening, filling the empty spaces where her life with Mark had once been. For so long, she had clung to the idea of a happy family, a stable marriage, and the comfort of close friends. Now, that world had crumbled, leaving her in a void she didn't know how to escape. As she parked in the driveway and looked up at her darkened house, a heavy realization settled in her chest. This was the beginning of a new life, but it wasn't one she had chosen. The first few days after the confrontation felt like a blur. Sarah went through the motions, caring for the children, keeping up appearances for their sake. But every glance at her home, every familiar corner, reminded her of the life that was now broken. She felt like a stranger in her own house, haunted by memories that once brought her comfort. Mark, aware that the betrayal had forever changed things between them, initially tried to talk to her. He left notes, sent texts, even attempted to sit down and explain himself, but Sarah wasn't ready to hear his explanations. Every word he spoke felt like salt in the wound, and every apology only deepened the pain. She needed time to process, to breathe, to find her footing before she could face him. But there was one moment she couldn't avoid. One evening, as she was putting the children to bed, her youngest son looked up at her, his big eyes filled with innocent concern. "Mommy, why does Daddy look sad?" Sarah's heart twisted painfully. She forced a smile, smoothing his hair. "Sometimes grown ups feel sad, honey," she replied, her voice barely steady. "But we'll all be okay. I promise." That promise felt both like a lie and a vow she intended to keep. She would do whatever it took to protect her children, to shield them from the hurt and chaos that had invaded their family. But protecting them also meant finding a way to rebuild herself. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself drawn to things she had long neglected: books she'd once loved, hobbies she had abandoned, little joys she had set aside while trying to hold her marriage together. She spent time with her children, focusing on them as an anchor amid the storm raging within her. Slowly, she reached out to friends outside of her small circle, those who hadn't known Lisa or Mark so well. A few coffee dates, casual conversations, and outings with other moms helped her realize she wasn't alone. Many of them shared stories of their own struggles, hardships that weren't unlike her own. The support and understanding she received helped her begin to feel whole again, if only in small pieces. One afternoon, she met with a lawyer. The reality of a separation or divorce was painful, but she knew she couldn't ignore it forever. Talking to the lawyer gave her a strange sense of control, a feeling that she could steer her life in a new direction. For the first time, She considered what life could be like without Mark, not as an empty space, but as a fresh start. But as much as she tried to distance herself, Mark's presence lingered. They had shared a life, a history, and he was the father of her children. He continued to send messages, pleading for a chance to talk, to make things right. Sarah felt torn between the need to heal on her own and the lingering feelings she still held for him, however damaged they might be. One evening, Mark showed up at the house unexpectedly, looking tired and worn, his face etched with guilt and regret. "Sarah, please," he said, his voice quiet, almost pleading. "Just give me a chance to talk." Sarah felt her defenses waver. She knew she wasn't ready for a conversation that might reopen her wounds, but she also knew she couldn't avoid it forever. Nodding, she gestured for him to come in, deciding it was time to face the difficult conversations she'd been avoiding. Sarah sat stiffly on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as Mark took a seat across from her. The room was quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the stillness. The children were asleep, and Sarah had no idea how to begin the conversation that had been looming over them for days. Mark's presence, though familiar, now felt like an intrusion, like someone she didn't know, someone who had broken her in ways she hadn't yet understood. He looked tired, worn down by guilt and shame, but there was something in his eyes, a glimmer of sincerity, or perhaps desperation, that made Sarah hesitate. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, each thought more painful than the last. Was this what it had come to? Did she still owe him an explanation, or was this just a moment of reckoning for them both? "I'm sorry, Sarah," Mark began, his voice hoarse, as if the words had been sitting on his tongue for too long. "I never meant for it to happen like this. I don't even know where to start." Sarah didn't respond right away, but her gaze never left him. She wanted to hear him out, even though every fiber of her being screamed for him to leave. She needed to know the truth, the whole truth, without any more half-formed excuses or vague explanations. Mark took a deep breath, rubbing his hands together nervously. "I've been thinking about this non-stop since that night. I know there's no excuse for what happened. What I did to you, to our family, it was unforgivable." He paused, his face contorted with pain. "But you have to understand, Sarah, I've been so lost. And Lisa, she was there for me when I felt like I was drowning." Sarah felt a knot tighten in her chest. Lisa, the woman who had been so much a part of their family, who had watched their children, who had been invited into their lives with open arms. Hearing Mark speak her name now felt like a betrayal of its own, as though the trust she had in both of them had been completely shattered. "Lost?" Sarah echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. How did this all happen? Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you talk to me?" Mark looked away, his eyes darkened with shame. "I don't know. I thought I could handle it on my own. I've been carrying so much weight, Sarah. Work, pressure, everything was just building up. And when I started feeling like I couldn't breathe, I didn't know who to turn to. I guess I turned to Lisa." His words were like a punch to the gut. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to maintain her composure. "You turned to her," she repeated, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "Instead of talking to your wife, the woman who has been by your side through everything, you turned to her." Mark's eyes flickered with guilt, but he didn't speak right away. The silence between them grew heavy, and Sarah's mind raced to piece together what she had learned, what she had witnessed: texts, late-night calls, secrets that had been hidden for far too long. "I'm not trying to justify it," Mark continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was a mistake. A huge mistake. I never meant to hurt you, Sarah. But what started as comfort turned into something I didn't expect, and by the time I realized what I'd done, I was too far in." Sarah clenched her fists, her nails biting into the palms of her hands. Too far in, she repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. You're telling me that you slept with her because you felt lost? Because you couldn't talk to me? Mark flinched, as though her words physically struck him. I never thought it would get this far. I never meant for you to find out like this. I didn't want to hurt you. I was just trying to feel something again. I didn't know what else to do. Sarah's eyes blurred with unshed tears, but she quickly blinked them away, not wanting to show him her vulnerability. She had been betrayed, and no amount of pleading, no matter how heartfelt, could undo the damage. You've destroyed everything, Mark, she said quietly, her voice trembling. You've destroyed us. You've destroyed me. Mark's face contorted in pain, his eyes pleading with her for some semblance of understanding. I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear. I love you, Sarah. I still love you. Please, just give me a chance to make this right. Her heart shattered at his words, at the desperation in his voice, but the anger and betrayal she felt overshadowed any lingering affection. How can you love me, Mark? How? After everything you've done? You think I can just forget what you did? What you let her do? Mark opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah held up a hand, silencing him. No, she said, her voice firm. There's nothing you can say that will fix this. I don't even know who you are anymore. She stood up, her legs shaking with the weight of the conversation. I can't do this anymore. I need space. I need time to think, to breathe. And you need to figure out who you really are, because this man sitting in front of me isn't the person I thought I married. Mark stood, too, his face pale and his expression desperate. Sarah, please. No, she cut him off, her voice sharp. I'm done. I can't keep living like this, with the lies and the deceit. I need to move on. With those final words, Sarah turned and walked out of the room, leaving Mark standing in the middle of the house they had once shared. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew one thing: her life, as painful as it was finally in her hands again. And that was something she hadn't felt in a long time.
If you found this story gripping, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on more intense and eye-opening stories just like this one. And remember, your support means everything. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.